Julian Ashford built a career playing men of honor, restraint, and quiet strength. For decades, audiences believed the calm in his eyes meant stability in his life. But behind the awards, the red carpets, and the reputation as one of Britain's most dignified leading men, something far more painful was unfolding. At 65, the real story of Julian Ashford is not about fame fading. It is about love, betrayal, humiliation, and rebuilding when the life you trusted collapses beneath you. Julian Ashford did not grow up chasing celebrity. Born in a quiet corner of Yorkshire to academic parents, he was raised in a home where intellect mattered more than emotion. His father taught classics at a local grammar school. His mother cataloged manuscripts for a regional archive. Dinner conversations revolved around literature, ethics, and history. Feelings were rarely the center of attention. For a sensitive boy who felt deeply but struggled to express it, that environment created a quiet tension that followed him into adulthood. Acting became his outlet. At drama school, he was not the obvious star. Rejection letters outnumbered callbacks. Yet casting directors noticed something unusual in him: the ability to communicate pain without exaggeration. He did not perform emotion loudly. He absorbed it and let it surface only at the edges of his eyes. His breakthrough arrived with a television adaptation of a Victorian novel, where he played a reserved landowner, concealing a broken heart beneath perfect manners. The performance turned him into a cultural fixture almost overnight. Suddenly, he was the embodiment of restrained masculinity, the man who waited patiently, loved consistently, and never lost composure. A string of period dramas followed, each one deepening the myth. But what audiences saw was a role. Off-screen, Julian had already developed a pattern that would define his private life. He was accommodating. He avoided confrontation. He believed devotion meant endurance. When he finally won the industry's highest honor for playing a wartime diplomat forced to negotiate peace while hiding his own grief, the irony was sharp. Here was an actor praised for portraying vulnerability while still swallowing his own. At that moment, he seemed untouchable, career at its peak, marriage stable, family secure. What no one realized was that the foundation of his personal life was already fragile, and when it cracked, the damage would not stay private. Julian met Elena Rossetti, an Italian set designer, while filming a co-production in Turin. She was sharp, opinionated, and utterly unlike the composed women he usually played on screen. He was cautious and reserved. She was passionate and outspoken, deeply invested in restoring historic buildings and championing sustainable architecture. Their connection was immediate but complicated. They married in a small ceremony overlooking the Tuscan hills and built a life between London and a restored farmhouse near Siena. They raised 2 children together, Marco and Sophia. Julian also had an older daughter, Ruth, from an earlier relationship with a stage actress he had never spoken about publicly. To the outside world, the Ashford family represented balance, half English reserve, half Italian warmth. They split their time between the English countryside and Tuscany, where Elena transformed their farmhouse into a working example of her restoration philosophy, hosting architecture students and sustainability advocates every summer. Julian funded her projects without hesitation. He praised her intelligence in interviews, called her the more interesting half of the marriage, and meant it. She built a small design studio that earned respect in European architecture circles. On red carpets, they appeared united and grounded, avoiding the glamour that defines so many industry couples. They projected seriousness and substance. But inside the marriage, there were dynamics that few saw. Julian deferred often. He supported her decisions quietly, adapted to keep the peace, and rarely voiced what he actually wanted. Friends later described him as someone who gave more than he asked for. Love, for him, seemed tied to being needed rather than being known. Years into the marriage, during a period when the two had quietly separated for several months without public acknowledgement, Elena began a relationship with a journalist who had been covering her restoration work. When the affair ended badly, the journalist began contacting her obsessively. Messages at odd hours, appearances near the farmhouse, a pattern that frightened her. She told Julian. He believed her without hesitation and stood by her when she pursued a restraining order. At the time, British and Italian press framed the story simply: a husband standing by his wife against a frightening intrusion. Julian gave a brief, careful statement expressing support for Elena and confidence in the legal process. The case moved through the courts quietly and was eventually settled outside a public trial. But the full picture, when it slowly surfaced months later, was more complicated than anyone had let on. Correspondence entered into the legal record revealed that the relationship between Elena and the journalist had not been the one-sided pursuit it first appeared to be. It had been mutual, at least for a time. During the period the couple had already been informally apart. The simple narrative of a devoted husband protecting his wife from an aggressor no longer held the same clarity. For Julian, the damage was not loud. It was corrosive. He had defended what he believed was the truth, publicly and without qualification. Now the truth looked blurred, and his name was permanently attached to a dispute that had grown murkier by the week. He had not lied, but he had trusted completely, and that trust had been used to shape a story that turned out to be only half true. The humiliation came in waves. The affair itself was painful enough. Infidelity after more than 2 decades of marriage carries a specific kind of sting, not just betrayal, but the collapse of shared history. Then came the scrutiny. Commentators speculated about what he knew and when he knew it. Every detail of the timeline was picked apart in profiles and opinion columns. Finally came the most destabilizing realization. His reputation, built over 30 years on quiet integrity, had been drawn into something that was no longer clean or simple. The case was settled, but settlements do not erase questions. The press, which had long treated him as something close to a national institution, grew quieter around him. The story never exploded into full tabloid chaos, but it lingered in the background, subtle, persistent, impossible to fully shake. In late autumn, the announcement arrived. After 23 years of marriage, Julian and Elena were separating. The language was careful and measured. They spoke of maintaining a close friendship and a shared commitment to their children. There was no bitterness in print, no accusations, no tell-all interviews. It was dignified to the end. But dignity does not cancel grief. Divorce after more than 2 decades is not just the end of a relationship. It dismantles the structure of daily life. Julian had built his adult identity around being part of a partnership that crossed cultures and continents. London and Tuscany, film premieres and restoration projects, public composure, and private routine. That narrative had defined him as much as any role he'd played. Now he was alone in London, negotiating legal settlements, property divisions, and financial arrangements that forced practical conversations about things he had once considered permanent. The Tuscan farmhouse that had symbolized shared ideals became an asset to divide on paper. Years of photographs and shared milestones became memories without a shared future. The timing deepened the impact. The divorce finalized during a stretch of global lockdowns that isolated him from distraction. Film production slowed. Award ceremonies were canceled or moved online. For the first time in decades, there was no schedule packed with scripts, rehearsals, or press tours to provide structure. Isolation magnifies reflection. Friends later indicated that he sought therapy, not to stage a comeback, not to manage headlines, but simply to understand how the marriage had reached that point. Therapy meant confronting difficult questions. Had he ignored warning signs? Had his need to keep the peace overridden his own instincts? Had devotion blurred over the years into self-erasure? It was not rage that defined this period. There were no public outbursts, no bitter interviews. Instead, there was a quieter reckoning. A man known for composure forced to sit with the fact that composure does not prevent collapse. Professionally, he continued appearing at events, offering polite interviews, promoting projects with the same measured charm audiences had always known. What they did not see was the exhaustion behind maintaining that steadiness. Humiliation does not always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like restraint. And while his personal world was unraveling quietly, another shift was forming. One that would test not his marriage, but his place in an industry that rarely waits for anyone to recover. Hollywood and the British film industry have always had an unspoken rule. Leading men are timeless, but only for a limited time. After Julian accepted his industry's highest honor for the wartime diplomat role, he seemed to have secured his place among the greats. The performance was layered, restrained, and deeply human. It confirmed what critics had known for years. He was not just charming, he was formidable. But prestige is not permanent currency in an industry obsessed with youth. As Julian moved into his 60s, the scripts changed. Romantic leads that once arrived effortlessly were now written for actors 20 years younger. Studio-backed dramas chasing award attention began centering on new faces. The offers that reached him increasingly cast him as mentors, fathers, and authority figures, important roles, but rarely the emotional center of the story. A long-running spy franchise became his most consistent professional anchor, casting him as a retired intelligence officer pulled back for one more mission in film after film. It was commercially successful and allowed him to work steadily, but it was not the kind of role that defines legacy the way intimate dramas do. It was entertainment, not coronation. Meanwhile, the industry itself was transforming. Streaming platforms overtook traditional studios. Algorithms shaped casting decisions. Public engagement through social media became part of an actor's market value. Younger performers cultivated online followings that translated directly into measurable audience numbers. Julian never embraced that shift. He remained private, almost analog in a digital world. No oversharing, no viral interviews, no reinvention campaign. He did not chase a narrative of comeback or rebirth. He simply worked. Yet working steadily is not the same as commanding the spotlight. Cultural relevance is subtle when it fades. There is no announcement, no ceremony that declares the crown has passed. Instead, it happens in increments. A missed shortlist, a role that goes elsewhere, a prestige project greenlit without your name attached. Financially, the landscape shifted too. Divorce settlements, cross-border property arrangements, and long-standing commitments alter even a comfortable fortune. Julian was far from struggling, but the era of the largest paydays attached to prestige projects was behind him. Stability required consistency, which meant saying yes to roles that, earlier in his career, he might have turned down. A handful of smaller independent films reminded audiences of his presence, carrying nostalgia rather than dominance, recognition without urgency. Aging in this industry is rarely dramatic. It is quiet displacement. The camera lingers a little less. The press coverage shrinks. Younger actors are framed as the future, while veterans become respected fixtures of the past. Unlike stars who implode publicly and later stage triumphant comebacks, Julian's struggles were never marketable. There was no scandal that could be repackaged as redemption, no recovery narrative, no explosive confession to reframe him. His crisis unfolded privately, a divorce, an emotional rebuilding, a subtle professional recalibration. He did not burn down his career. It simply shifted beneath his feet, just as he was navigating that quiet transition, stepping into more reflective roles and adjusting his own expectations. Another challenge emerged, one tied not to a personal scandal, but to a difficult subject he chose to portray on screen. Julian took the lead in a limited series dramatizing a real historical tragedy, playing a grieving father who spent decades pursuing accountability after a disaster that had killed dozens of people. For families connected to the actual events, the dramatization reopened old wounds. Advocacy groups criticized production's graphic recreation of the tragedy, arguing that certain scenes were unnecessary, and that marketing the show as based on a true story risked shaping public opinion ahead of ongoing legal proceedings. Producers responded by pointing to their research process and the disclaimers accompanying each episode. Julian himself did not engage publicly in the debate. He remained measured, letting the production team respond to criticism directly. But the irony was heavy. An actor quietly working through his own private grief was portraying another man's very public fight against injustice. The backlash did not damage his career, but added another emotional layer to a period already defined by sensitivity. Once again, he found himself at the center of a story shaped by loss. This time, one he had chosen to tell. Meanwhile, in his personal life, something unexpected was taking shape. Years after the divorce, Elena gave interviews describing herself and Julian as still close, an extended, unconventional family. Both had moved on to new partners. She spoke openly about a serious health scare she had faced, her continued restoration work in Tuscany, and the eventual closure of her design studio. According to her, she and Julian had worked hard to preserve a sense of unity for their children. They attended school events and family milestones together, alongside their new partners, without tension. She said she did not miss the industry circuit that once surrounded her marriage and had come to view the period as a separate chapter of her life. Julian, for his part, remained private about his own romantic life. Occasional rumors surfaced, but he never confirmed details publicly. At 65, he appears to have accepted a quieter existence. Smaller films, occasional stage work, a steady relationship with his adult children. The tragedy of his story is not explosive. It is gradual. A man who believed in endurance learned that endurance does not guarantee security. A husband who prioritized harmony discovered that silence can hide fracture. An actor who built his image on dignity had to live through humiliation without losing that dignity. He did not collapse. He did not lash out. He did not publicly assign blame. He absorbed it. Julian Ashford's story did not end in scandal or disgrace. It shifted, painfully and publicly, into something different, quieter, harder to name, but no less real. Do you think staying graceful in the face of betrayal is strength, or does it cost too much? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe.